The men came at midday, when the whole village could see. They packed stones into the mouth of the widow's oven, one on top of the last until the opening was gone. She stood in her doorway with flour still on her hands. Behind her on the board, that morning's dough had gone stiff, forgotten. "The village has no use for one woman's fire any more," said the man doing the packing. He was the headman's cousin. He did not look at her while he said it. She said nothing. When the last stone was set, she stepped past the men, reached into the sealed mouth where a gap still remained near the bottom, and worked one loose stone free from the old hearth floor. It was scorched black on one face, plain gray on the other. She turned it over once, then carried it inside and set it on the shelf above the door. She did not cry until the door was shut. Her husband had built the oven the autumn before the coughing sickness took him. He dug the clay from the stream bank, mixed it with straw and ash, and shaped the dome over a wicker frame he later burned out once it had dried hard. It took him the better part of a month, worked between other chores, and neighbors thought it strange labor for a man already thin with the cough that would kill him within the year. He learned fire slowly, by getting it wrong first. She learned the same way, until his knowing became hers. Rye dough wanted a slower heat than wheat. A fire banked wrong at dusk gave nothing back by morning. Nobody taught her this in words. She had simply watched it happen enough times. Most households kept no oven of their own. Building and firing one took more wood than most families could spare, so bread traveled instead. A loaf or two carried to whoever's hearth was large enough, traded for eggs, wool, a day's labor at harvest. People had come to her door for years before anyone thought to build another oven. The new one stood behind the chapel now, raised at the headman's urging and mostly at his expense. Turns were assigned. Grain was measured out. The widow's small clay oven, tucked behind her garden wall, became something the village said it no longer needed. She had not argued the point. She simply kept baking there on the days that were not her turn at the new one, trading the odd loaf for thread or a mended shoe. It was this, the oven still warm when it was meant to sit cold, that finally brought the men with their stones. A boy started appearing near her wall not long after. He was an orphan, kept by a family 3 cottages down, that gave him the coldest corner and the last portion at every meal. He wore a coat 2 sizes too large, handed down from an older cousin, and never complained of the cold, though his hands showed it. At first she thought he came only for the broken crusts, the misshapen ends too rough to trade. She gave them to him without comment, once leaving one deliberately on the low wall where he passed, as though she had simply forgotten it there. He came back the next day and the one after. Then, for the better part of 2 months, he stopped coming at all. The family that kept him had sent him off to help an uncle with sheep further up the valley, and nobody thought to tell her why. She noticed his absence before she admitted to herself that she had noticed it. He returned in early autumn, thinner, saying nothing about where he had been. She did not ask. She set out a crust and went on with her work, and after a while he picked it up and stayed, as if no time had passed at all. He watched her hands. He watched how she read the smoke rising from the chimney hole, how she judged the oven's heat by holding her palm just inside the mouth and counting under her breath. "Why do you count?" he asked her once. It was the first full sentence she had heard from him. "Fire doesn't lie," she said, "but it forgets itself if nobody reminds it what it's for." He did not understand this, but he began bringing her things anyway, unasked. A flat stone from the stream bed, dry gorse for kindling, clay dug where the bank ran soft. The first attempt at the dome collapsed within a week. The clay too wet and the frame beneath it burned out too soon. They started again in the spring. This time, she made him wait 3 full days before lighting the frame, though he wanted to do it sooner and complained once that the waiting was foolish. She did not answer him, and by the 3rd day he had stopped asking why. They worked through most of that year in pieces, an afternoon here, a week of nothing when the harvest needed hands elsewhere, another afternoon once the barley was in. Neither of them spoke much while they worked. By the time the first cold nights came again, the old shape had come back stone by stone, the new stones paler than the old ones and likely to stay that way for years. That same summer, a neighbor came to borrow her second bucket, the wooden hoop having split on her own, and kept it so long the widow finally walked over and asked for it back herself. The neighbor returned it without apology, and the widow said nothing more of it, though she noticed the bucket came back with a crack in the base that had not been there before. One loaf burned black that spring because she had let herself talk too long with a woman from up the lane about a wedding neither of them cared much about, and she gave the ruined loaf to the pig and started again without complaint. Some people still laughed at her, though less than before. One old man mentioned at the well that her husband had once baked bread for half the valley during a hard winter years back, when the pass froze shut for a month and no grain could be carried in. He said it plainly, without much weight behind it. It settled into people anyway. A few of the younger women began stopping at her wall on their way home from that same well. One asked a good deal about dough and timing, nodded at every answer, and later told half the market that the widow claimed the new bakehouse was cursed, which the widow had never said. It came back to her second hand, the way such things do, and she said nothing about it, though she was more careful after that about what she said aloud and to whom. That woman never did learn otherwise, and went on repeating the story for years, long after most people had stopped believing it. The headman's wife noticed the visits to the wall before anyone spoke of them outright. She said nothing about it either, not yet. One afternoon, that same autumn, the boy chased a pair of hens clean across her garden and into the neighbor's cabbages, laughing in a way she had not heard from him before, and she let the fence sit broken until after supper rather than call him back to mend it right then. At the Sunday market, with frost already whitening the stubble fields, the headman's wife found the widow among the wool stalls and spoke loud enough to be heard. "You shame the bakehouse," she said, "keeping your little fire lit behind your wall like it's still needed. Maybe you cling to old ways because you've nothing else left to cling to." The widow set down the thread she had been holding. "Old ways aren't holy for being old," she said. "New ways aren't wise just because the powerful put their names on them. I keep my oven because I understand its heat. I've never claimed to understand yours." Nobody answered that. The market went back to its business. More than one person glanced toward the chapel roof, where the chimney, for once, was not smoking at all. The storm arrived 3 weeks later, the kind that shuts a valley in for the whole season. Snow piled against the doors. The pass closed. The last trading cart had already gone, carrying off the year's wool and any chance of more grain before spring. The harvest that autumn had come in thinner than most years besides, the barley stunted by a wet summer. A household laid in what it could through the autumn and lived on that until the roads opened again. Root cellars held what turnips and cabbage had kept. Smoked meat hung in the rafters. Most years this was managed without much talk. This year the talk started early because the village had put its faith in one large oven instead of many small ones, and one large oven could fail all at once. The bakehouse had been fired too hard, too often, by hands still learning its unfamiliar shape. One night the back walls split, a crack loud enough to carry across the square. Smoke that should have risen thin and steady from the chapel chimney stopped rising at all. A dozen households' worth of dough sat unbaked, souring in the cold. The headman called it a small matter, easily mended. Nobody believed him. By the second morning, families had already begun cutting their flour rations short, guessing at how long the rest would need to last. The widow looked at the broken bakehouse from her own doorway. She watched the chimney for the better part of a morning, waiting for smoke that did not come. Then she sent the boy door to door, before first light, to say, "Bring what dough you have, and come to the garden wall." Not everyone came at once. One household sent word back that they would manage on their own a while longer, unwilling to be seen needing her help so soon after the market. They came 2 days later anyway, quietly, after dark. And she said nothing about the wait. She showed the younger women how to bank coals so the heat held through the night without wasting wood. Wood was too dear that winter to burn carelessly. She taught 2 older boys to judge the oven's readiness by smell and sound instead of guessing. She set the baking order herself. The households with the least flour first, the rest after, and had families take turns feeding the fire and carrying wood, so the cost of keeping it lit fell on no single household. She worked from before light until well past dark, 4 days running. Someone left a bowl of thin broth by the oven door one evening without a word about who had brought it. On the coldest night, she found the boys' wet boots set too near the fire to dry properly and moved them back herself before they scorched, saying nothing to him about it in the morning. When wood ran short on the 3rd day, it was the boy who thought to ask the households already fed to send back what they could spare. Nobody thought it strange that a boy claimed by no one should be the one asking. The valley got through the worst week of that winter on the oven the village had once filled with stones. Nobody made a speech about it. One evening, after the last loaves had gone out warm under cloth, the widow set 2 bowls on the table instead of 1. "Shut the door," she told the boy, who stood uncertain in the frame. "You're letting the heat out." He shut it. He stayed. Nothing more was said about what it meant. The next morning there were still 2 bowls, and the morning after that, until nobody in the household could have said exactly when it stopped being an arrangement and started being a family. Years after, the boy was a man grown, with a son of his own crouched beside him in the garden. He knelt one spring to fix a crack that had opened again in the oven's mouth. Most of the stones he set in were new, squared and pale. One, small, scorched black on one face, sat loose in his palm, saved out from the rest. "Why keep that ugly one?" his son asked, "when the others are so much newer?" He turned it over, the way he had once seen a woman do, long before he understood what he was watching. She had told him once, near the end, why she kept it above the door all those years, instead of setting it back into the wall where it came from. It was the first stone she had pulled loose the day the men sealed the oven shut, kept not for what it had been, but so that whenever the household built or mended a fire afterward, that one stone went in first, at the very back of the mouth, closest to the heat. Every oven repaired since carried a piece of the one that had been buried. Nothing that had once fed people stayed sealed away for good, not while that stone had somewhere to go. He set it now where it belonged, deep in the mouth of the oven, the newer stones built up around it. "So the fire remembers where it started," he said. Nobody in the valley could have said by then exactly how the custom had begun. But every winter after that, For as long as the oven stood, the first loaf went to the house with the least flour.